Okay, so I'm gonna start off with land acknowledgement. Acknowledging that we reside in the homelands of the indigenous peoples is an important step in recognizing the history and the original stewards of these lands. Land acknowledgements must extend far beyond words. The United States has worked hard to erase the narratives of indigenous peoples over time. Land acknowledgements statements can help remind us of the history of the contributions and sacrifices Native peoples have made. We honor and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories and the ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. This area, specifically the confluence of the Platte and the Cherry Creek rivers, was the epicenter for trade, information sharing, planning for the future, community, family, and ally building, as well as conducting healing ceremonies for over 45 indigenous nations, including the Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, Paiute, Zuni, Hopi, and among others. We must recognize indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land. And as these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, remember the ties that these nations still have to their traditional homelands. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory and pay our respects to the diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land. Let us also give thanks to all the tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. And this land acknowledgement was written by Gracie Redshirt Tyon, the Director of American Indian Student Services at CU Denver, who is Lakota. And I think we also need to acknowledge those individuals who were displaced on the Auraria campus to build CU Denver. And those were predominantly Latinx, Mexican families. And next, we'll do a brief bio for Suzi. For those who don't know, Suzi Q. Smith is an award-winning artist, activist, and educator who lives in Denver, Colorado. A forthcoming collection of poems, A Gospel of Bones, will be available from Alternating Current Press in March 2021. Her second collection, Poems for the End of the World, will be available from Finish Line Press in June 2021. Suzi Q has also worked extensively as an activist with civil rights organizations, victims advocate organizations, arts organizations, peace organizations, hospitals, prisons, and more. She was the founding slam master of Denver's Slam Nubia, and she spent 12 years in the poetry slam arena as a coach, organizer, and performer. In addition, she worked extensively with youth, served as a teaching assistant with Youth on Record, and as a coach of Denver Minor Disturbance Youth Poetry Slam, resulting in 2 international championships. Currently, Suzi is at work on her next collection while she continues to teach creative writing. And then finally, I just want to go through the community guidelines, which we'll also put in the chat for everyone else. I will lean into conversations. I will believe everyone is doing their best most of the time. I will critique ideas and not people. I will use I statements. I will accept the lack of closure. I will not make assumptions about other people's identities. I will take care of my needs and take breaks if I need to. And I will agree that what is shared here stays here, but what is learned here leaves here. And I will pass it off to Suzi.
Thank you so much for that introduction, James. Thank you for the land acknowledgement, and thank you for welcoming me here. I love that we already started out with some community guidelines, and thanks for reading the bio. I'm realizing now, I'm like, oh, I should update that because that was written before March 2021. It's now April 2021, so A Gospel of Bones is out. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for all of you who are here in real time, and all of you who are watching this later. I'll do my best to keep this relevant for all parties involved, whether you're here now or watching this later. My name is Suzi Q. Smith, and I'm a writer. I'm a poet mostly, but I've been doing a lot of different things for my whole life. Generally, I identify as an artist, activist, and educator, and those 3 words pretty much describe most of the work that I do in the world and have done in the world thus far. So today, we'll be talking about the political, the personal, and the poetic, and the way that those things intersect. And also, so I'll be reading you a few poems. We'll be talking about some things, And I'm also going to give you some writing prompts. So it'll be part talk, part workshop. And ideally, there will be some space for you to share at the end of this for those of you who are here in real time. If you would like to, of course, no pressure, right? So there will be a little bit of time for us to talk as well, and Q&A. So I'm hoping that we can do all of those things today. And I think we have enough time to. So hello and welcome. Thank you for being here. I thought I'd kick us off with a little bit of conversation around what I consider, like when I titled this talk and what we were sort of discussing as part of the theme of what the university is working on. Also, I'm a graduate of the University of Colorado at Denver. I don't know if you know that, but that is a true thing as well. So I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. So when I think about the political and the personal and the poetic, I really do believe that the personal and the political and personal are the same and that they are inseparable. And that's probably largely because I was born into that knowledge, right? Um, I have been myself for my entire life. I was born in Denver, Colorado, and I was born Black and female and biracial Black in Denver, Colorado. And so all of those things definitely impacted my upbringing and the way that the world responds to me. I became aware at a very young age that my identity was already highly politicized before I ever did anything even remotely political, right? And so the way that I think of those things, I'm also keenly aware that upbringing and where I'm from and how I'm shaped have changed the way that I see the world, right? Have deeply impacted the way that I view the world. I'm also a deeply feeling person as a poet, right? And that's a lot of where the poetic comes into. Been writing poetry since I could hold a pen. I come from poets. I come from a very artistic family. We are deeply feeling people. We are deeply expressive people. And so a lot of that is all tied in together into the way that I see the world, the way I interact with the world, and of course, the way the world interacts with me. So all of those things impact each other. So I thought I'd start perhaps by reading us a poem called Black Hole Mouth. And this is a little bit about, it's a collection of some of the ways that people respond to me in my life. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with what I've sort of coined this term, a complisult, right? It was when someone gives you a compliment and an insult at the same time, or when you're not really sure whether you thank them or cuss them out after they're gone. Anybody know what? Yeah, I've seen some people in the chat. You know what I'm talking about, right? So you're like, wait a minute, was that? Um, and that was one of the ways that I realized that the way that people were receiving me, there's always been sort of an interesting series of microaggressions in my daily life since forever, ever. And so this poem has a little bit to do with that. And so this is something that I use as an introduction, and it's called Black Hole Mouth. You could be so pretty if you would just do this one thing. If you would just do this one thing, if you would just get in your place, Suzi Q. I saved it for you. Get in your lane, Suzi Q. You are too big for your britches, but you can hide in my bed. I made it for you. Get in your place, Suzi Q. You should be more grateful. Some people don't even know where their place is. I saved this space for you. Maybe you should cover some of that up, Suzi Q, or maybe you should show it all, or maybe you should shake it, girl. Maybe you should shake it. I don't want it though, but you should want me to, and I might if you try sometimes. And what kind of name is that anyway, Suzi Q? Is that some kind of cultural thing? And did that come from your mother's people? And what kind of people are they anyway? And what kind of people are you? And what are you, Suzi Q? Who told you that you do not need permission to speak? Who are you to use words like that? How dare your mouth be so big and not smiling? And maybe you should be more quiet, and maybe you should whisper in my ear first before you speak out loud, Suzi. Everyone can tell you don't belong here. And if your feet were not so big, Suzi, and if you were not so black, Suzi, or if you could just be black enough, or maybe if your hips could narrow and your lips tuck in, if your hair could be more polite, if your face would just apologize, always arguing with itself so publicly, if you could just be pretty in a way that doesn't scare me. And why you always got to scare me, Suzi, and why do you spill over all of the cups and be so impossible to fold into boxes? And where is the cage that can contain the inferno of your ideas? And why is your mouth on fire, Suzi? Why is your mouth always on fire? If you could be more, if you could be more simple, if you could be less black hole, if you could suck yourself in and swallow without taking all of us with you, we could forgive you, Suzi. We could forgive you. And so that is how I feel about microaggressions, and some of the ways in which people respond to me. And so this collection of things that people tell me, right? And a lot of these are very, very direct quotes of things I've heard from people on multiple occasions. And the ways that people will sort of, and complete strangers will take this sort of ownership of your identity, in an effort to be helpful, to like sort of make you like fit in with whatever your environment is, as if that is my goal, or as if that is what I'm supposed to do, right? Is fit into whatever their idea of a person is. And just generally, in whatever environment I'm in, I'm going to be disrupting that in some way, right? And so I've learned about myself that I'm often a bringer of change, right? And so if the status quo is serving you, and if you've adapted to it, if you're comfortable with it, or if you're within that realm of power, then oftentimes my presence is going to confuse or bother you, right? Because I'm generally a bringer of change, and it's coming with me, right? And so when I'm in a space, I'm going to be doing my best to adapt it into a place that is safer for me as well. And so that is not most of the world already, which means I have to change it, as part of my process, as part of my just carving out space for myself to exist, right? And so I think that's part of my obligation and part of my journey. It's necessary. So in that, right, I end up with some very interesting conversations with a lot of people. And so that very first line came actually from a dentist, right? Saying, "Oh, you could be just so well." People have told me I could be pretty for a lot of different reasons, but there was one dentist who told me I'd be so pretty if I could just close that gap. Oh, but I love my gap, guys. I'm not closing this. What? Do you see it? I love the gap. Shout out to all of my gap havers as well. You are my people. I'm your people. We got gaps and they're wonderful. So anyway, those are many, many experiences, right? But also the comfort that people feel with me approaching me and telling me these sorts of things, or wanting to touch my hair, ask me questions about it, right? All of those things happen pretty regularly. Fortunately, I've not had any hair touching in this past year because we've been in a pandemic, and I hope that that's something that is not ever going to happen again. But all of these things made it very clear to me that my identity was something that other people felt a way about, right? And I realized that already it was pretty political again before I ever got here. And so my response to it again is shaping that world. So I grew up in Denver, Colorado. I'm from Park Hill, which has changed a lot since I grew up. I'm from the 1980s Park Hill, very different than the Park Hill that is now, um, which is important to point out. I will share a poem about some of those transitions in the neighborhood I grew up in versus the place that people know it as today. But I think also it's important to kind of point out that in growing up in Park Hill, which was still a pretty Black neighborhood when I was growing up in Denver, discovering the world around me, right, and the way that it was shaped, and how different that has become, and again, it compels me to respond to it, right. I'm a deeply feeling person, which is what makes me an artist. I'm a deeply feeling person, which is what makes me an activist, right. So the very first time that I was ever pepper sprayed by police at a protest, I was 14 years old. In those years in Denver, Colorado, on Martin Luther King Day, which I'm not sure if you're aware of this. So in Denver, Martin Luther King Day is a pretty huge celebration. We have the second largest Martin Luther King Day celebration in the country. We're second only to Atlanta. At least that was true some years ago. I'm not sure if that's true today, but that used to be true. Second or third, for sure, of the largest celebrations having a Martin Luther King Day parade. Also in the 1990s, early 90s, there was a large contingent of white supremacist organizations that would gather at our state capitol on Martin Luther King Day and hold their rally at the same time as the march. So while some people were celebrating the march, across the street, there were people in Klan robes and skinheads and et cetera, white supremacists with their signs and et cetera. So at 14 years old, I decided after the march that I was going to go protest the white supremacists. It became wild. And that was the very first time that I was pepper sprayed by police. And that is probably what made me really an activist, right? That was my introduction to it, because I simply just couldn't allow the things they were saying to be said without compelling a conversation, if you will. So that is how I began. And then, of course, I started working for a civil rights organization when I was 18. And my life has been a series of a lot of different movements, a lot of different organizations, grassroots, and then larger organizations, et cetera, since, and education has been a part of that process as well. So as we go through today, I'm going to share with you a few poems, some of them personal, all of them personal, all of them political. I do say that every poem I write is a love poem, right? And it's a love for the larger people, love for myself, love for the world. And oftentimes pretty aggressively asking it to shift, asking it to change. So there are, but I will pause here and there so we can have some quick conversations. Before I begin launching into more poems, any questions, comments, concerns about anything so far? I love a dialogue, so the more that we can chat with each other, I'm into it.
Where can we pick up?
A Gospel of Bones is available now. A Gospel of Bones is available wherever you purchase your books from. You can get it directly from the publisher, which is Alternating Current Press. And I can post a link to it here in the chat, tinyurl.com, Gospel of Bones. So it's called A Gospel of Bones, and that book is available now. And then the new one coming out, they're both new. Because of COVID, A Gospel of Bones came out a year later than we initially planned for it to. So that means I ended up with twin books that's both coming out in 2021. So that's how that happened. And Poems for the End of the World is coming out in June. And that is on pre-sale now with Finishing Line Press. So I've just posted both of those links in the chat for you if you'd like to take a look at those. And several of the poems I'm sharing are in one book or the other. So any other questions, comments, concerns? Oh, I do have a website, suziqsmith.com, and you can find all like upcoming events, etc., posted there. Also, I'm all over social media, deep in these internet streets. So I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and I have one video up on TikTok. I'm getting there. It's just a random video of me lip syncing to an Usher song, but hey, I'm on all the things. I also checked yesterday. I still have a MySpace page, so we are on all of the social media. But the easiest way to find me is probably suziqsmith.com. Any other questions, comments, concerns? I thought that perhaps I would share a couple of poems from a series of sonnets. Again, talking about sort of how I became a person, how I became aware of the world around me, and sort of how it shaped me, right? And so all of this, again, is a result, right? I create from both the excess and the void. And so it's really observing the world around me, navigating it, and interpreting it, right? And all of that has some pretty profound political implications as well, particularly when you have a highly politicized identity, which again, I do. So I'm going to share a couple of sonnets with you that talk a little bit about the shifting neighborhood that I grew up in. And then I will share a piece that is a contrapuntal that's navigating the place that it was and the place that it is becoming. So the overall collection of the sonnets is called This Crown Crooked Anyway. And I'll just read a couple of those. So it starts with one, the rapture came in the early 90s. At church, they used to take the kids into the basement to show us poor-made horror movies on the rapture, remind us we don't want to be the ones they leave, and Jesus only wants the well-behaved. So when the kids around you start to disappear, you better pray and get right with the Lord, and baby, would you believe it? Other kids began to slip off into Jesus' arms. The Bible says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. You heard about that boy whose clothes were always dirty, flashed a gun all over 7th grade and disappeared. I'm saying, you act like you don't see these empty seats. I pray until my knees bruise, my knuckles tight glowing. I'm singing Pass Me Not on my way back home from school. 2, find a sweet relief. I'm still singing Pass Me Not on my way back home from school. The walk is long, an exercise in faith and violence. I tuck my chin, quick my pace, try not to be a target. Who got time to be anybody's victim anyway? I've never been in a fight I wasn't dragged away from. This is not to say that I won them, just that violence is a language I have learned, inherited, and practiced. A mother tongue always lies dormant in my mouth and blood. Stop all that before I give you something to cry about. One time, Me and Genevieve fought Quentin on the same day. I got up bloody again and then again, wild swinging, knowing the only one coming to save me is Jesus. What if I'm my only hero? What if you are yours? You ever snatch your breath out the mouth of a barking dog? 3. They called it the summer of violence. You ever snatch your breath out the mouth of a barking dog? We grew up in the 80s, back when the blocks were still ours. White flight had left the guts of cities to our grandparents. There was a war on drugs. Nancy Reagan was on TV. We lived with our grandmother and we wore hand-me-down clothes. Used to brag about my wealthy father like I knew him, pretend like I didn't have to share a bed with my cousin. We were royal ancient children. We were at-risk youth. We were young lords of the flies, wrestling our fate and future inheritance from statistics. We learned to steal ourselves. Do you remember the summer of 1993, when the boys that we all used to know became murderers, when all the girls began to know we would become widows? Blessed be the Lord, my strength, which teacheth my hands to war. So those are the first 3. And then I'm going to share a little bit more from the pieces as they continue to go, right? So I'm going to skip up to number 7 in this series, which is called Sometimes They Put Your Family in Cages. Forget where you come from, remember who you are. My little cousin calls on a Wednesday evening, and I apologize for missing his court date. But Nana was in the hospital, and he says, thank you for the money on my books. And I say, your grandma's doing better since the heart attack. He asks if I will tell everyone he loves them. He asks if Nana's still mad about his tattoos. The DA offered him 40 years if he pleads. He didn't even do it, but he'll take 20 if he can see his son again before he's grown. He asks, when I was little, did you ever think I would end up here? Our anchored blood pours heavy when love is our only home and a mudslide too. 8. Middle age might as well be paradise. When love is our only home and a mudslide too, we dance and drown and bury ourselves in fistfuls. Melvin got shot while driving his El Camino on the same afternoon as my bridal shower. He survived, was still a groomsman in our wedding. Tariq didn't get his tux in time, but he came to the reception looking clean as ever. A few years later, he was killed at his front door. Russ is skinny, but the cancer's in remission. Maybe it was prayer, or maybe the chicken broth. His belly almost looks like a place I once knew. Dear God, I love seeing men I have loved get old and grouchy, complain about new trends in hip hop. Yes, I love the sweet silver whiskers in your beards. So I'll pause there for a moment as we continue to have some of these conversations around the personal, the political, right? As all of these are sort of an exploration of very autobiographical reflections of what I observed, what I experienced, what I witnessed, um, and how they relate to a larger story, right? And that's a lot of what happens with storytelling, with poetry, as we observe, witness, and share our truths and our experiences, you discover your connection to a larger role, right? You discover your place in society, you discover who's winning, you discover who's invested in things staying the same and who's invested in change, right? You learn to follow the money, you learn to follow the power, right? And again, all of that is political, right? And so just the very nature of sharing a story, sharing your own story, sharing your own narrative, contributing to that, right, is a political act. So any questions, comments, concerns about any of that thus far? Okay.
I like how it's relatable.
That, I mean, for some people it is informative, and for some people it's very much, some people are able to empathize, right? Because as I mentioned, right, this is my story, but it's not only my story, right? And the more that I share it, the more I realize, like, oh, this is a lot of people's stories. This is a lot of people's truths, right? There are Park Hills all over the world, right? You know, think about that Lauryn Hill song, every ghetto, every city, right? You know, I think about, right, these stories are commonplace, right? But they're also not often shared. There are so many pieces that we are taught to not share, not celebrate, right? And so many of these stories are hidden in the shadows, and so many of these stories are not told, right? So it makes me think of one of my favorite quotes about writing and storytelling, right? Is this quote from the author Arundhati Roy, in which she says, there is really no such thing as voiceless, right? They're only the deliberately silenced or preferably unheard. And so I'm sure we've all heard this sort of voice for the voiceless, which grates my skin every time I hear someone say they're trying to be like the voice for the voiceless, because I agree with Arundhati Roy. There are no voiceless. They're preferably silenced and unheard. So my goal generally is to encourage everyone to use their voice, right? And to pass the mic, right? You don't need to be a voice for the voiceless. You just offer your platform and share space to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. And the more that you do that and create equitable platforms for story sharing, right, the more that our collective narrative shifts, the more that power shifts, right? And that again is a political act, right? So
How do you develop your own?
so it is me, a lot of it, right? Again, I'm a deeply feeling person, and so my goal is to share those feelings with people as much as possible. Right? I can't feel all these things by myself. I also can't contain these feelings in my body, so I have to explode them onto pages. So that's part of the process, right? Um, if it makes you feel like you might cry, that's fine. I'm team normalize crying, but also most of it's written through a lot of tears, right? I experience it, observe it, and have to feel all these feelings before I can even begin to write about it. And then there's this process, right? My writing practice involves a lot of crying. There's a lot of crying. There's pacing, sometimes throwing things, sometimes cussing. There's a lot of things that happen in part of my creative practice. But it begins with living, right? Experiencing, observing, paying attention to what I see around me and what I feel inside me, and giving that some kind of a voice. I'm never really sure whether I'm creating something that's going to get shared with an audience or not, but I do stay in a regular practice of observing my thoughts and feelings, and ideally making those onto a page somewhere. Doesn't always make it to the page because sometimes my writing practice is a little distracted, is what I'll call it. Um, but giving it some sort of a shape. And again, like I, it's not always poems, right? So I write poems mostly, and that is my main jam. However, I also write songs, I also write plays, I also write essays, I also write a bit of prose, right? So there's a little bit of creative nonfiction. So there's a few different ways that it might show up, but sometimes, right, it might show up in a stew. It might show up in, a dress that I make. It might show up in a bread that I need to like put my hands in some dough, right? It might show up in a lot of different ways. All of that is part of the creative practice, right? Living is part of the creative practice. Being able to feel feelings is part of that creative practice. And so all of that, and then it comes into writing, right? And when it comes to the community that supported me, I've been very, very grateful to be one. I was born into a very artistic family. So poetry is a normal part of my family's practice, right? Reciting poetry is not abnormal for me, right? That's something that happens at family reunions, right? We do this. So my great grandfather wrote poetry, right? He was a poet. He taught his children to recite poetry, right? I was raised by his daughter, my grandmother. So this is all part of my normal practice. So again, it's part of my family, and then also part of my cultural tradition, right? So I grew up in Denver. When I was about, I'm going to say 19-ish, Ashara Ekundayo started Cafe Nuba in Denver. So Cafe Nuba, it's hot and it's black. Shout out to Ashara Ekundayo and the Pan-African Art Society and all the many, many people that held that organization together over the years. And so Cafe Nuba was definitely a place where I was able to go share. I also started reading poetry at every open mic I could find as a teenager, right? So a lot of Denver's open mic and poetry scene helped me to find that voice and get more comfortable because my nature is very shy. So I was not at all comfortable performing when I was a young person, but I would go to these open mics with this little shaking paper in my hand and I would read over this whirring espresso machine in the background. And so I would go to a lot of different readings hosted by Henry Alarm Clock, also known as Zach Kopp, at different coffee shops, which are mostly not in existence anymore, but also the Mercury Cafe, which is very much still alive and thriving. So the Mercury Cafe is another place. Their Friday night open mic is the longest standing open mic in Colorado. So there are many of those places. And then also like eventually like making my way then, and then through Cafe Nuba, freedom of speech, the Poet is Muse, many different open mics that have happened around Denver, and finding those spaces and any place where I could just share and connect with people, right? Because most of those it's about building community every bit as much as it is about creating art, right? So, and giving a voice to something that isn't often voiced and finding people that go, aha, I feel that way too. And the more that you do that, then the more urgent and necessary it all feels, right? You can connect to people that feel the way that you feel. And also, people in the audience can know that they're not the only ones that feel that way, right? And so that's how we like sort of build. And a lot of people that I met at these open mics over the years are like family to me now, right? And then later through the poetry slam world, I spent a long time in poetry slam. So working with Slam Nuba and also the Mercury Cafe Poetry Slam, but also then nationally. And so for several years, I was the executive director of Poetry Slam Inc., which oversaw all the poetry slams in North America and ran the National Poetry Slam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I spent a lot of time really, really building community in those spaces. And that helped shape my voice in a large way and also shape my life, right, in perspective. Um, the slam community is extremely, extremely diverse and very, very inclusive. And so I got to learn from a lot of different style of writers and a lot of different kinds of people in that space. And they broadened my worldview and also expanded my heart in some pretty profound and unchangeable ways. So I'm grateful for that forever. So those are a few, but a lot of it, it's crying, it's practice, it's and it's making friends with people who feel deeply as well, even if we don't feel the same way. We definitely make each other feel something. And if we do that, I think that we're at least interrupting apathy. And again, interrupting that status quo, which is again, a political act. So personal, political, poetic, all of them coexist at every moment for me. So I would love to read you guys a love poem, if that's cool. If we can get into a little love poem. As I mentioned, all of my poems are love poems, yeah, but there's one that's particularly on my heart and always has been really. This poem is over 10 years old now. I was asked to come to a vigil that some friends were organizing at the ICE detention center here in Aurora, Colorado. And this has been a little more than 10 years ago. And they were organizing this vigil, candlelight vigil for the detainees on Valentine's Day, 2011. And so I was like, well, that is my kind of love. Yeah, I can definitely write a love poem and come and read that to the people who are detained inside. And of course, we weren't able to go inside, but what we did, we gathered around the space and we surrounded the facility and we had bullhorns and we were reading love poems, right, to the people. But I also wanted to be as clearly heard and understood by the detainees as possible. And so this poem is for them. And unfortunately, it has not lost any relevance in the last 10 years. And so this poem is called I Don't Know How to Love You in English. I cannot tell by its rhythm where this heart was born. It is only music pulsing through palms. We know this when we hold hands. Let whispers tickle ears, whatever language they assume. I do not know how to cry in English. No sé cómo llorar en español. Tears are born world citizens. They do not need to speak to find each other, to rush into rivers that cannot be dammed. I will not ask the wind where it is from. It would only answer with its coming and going, does not recognize these fences or lines, does not even see them. I will not ask the monarchs for a passport, will not pinch them from the air and pin them for their passage, will not shoot them as they fly away. I will not shush the roaring seas beating upon the border from another nation's shore, will not pretend its origin is worth less or more. We are each of us worth our weight in water or in papeles. I will not ask each grain of sand from whence it came, will not interrogate the sediments and segregate them by shade. I will not cast a net around the beaches. I do not know how to love you in English. No sé cómo te amo en español. Only know that all life begins with love that cannot be walled or conquered. I do not know where love comes from. Only know that it resides in me, in the descansos dotting the desert. I do not know what language bullets speak. Have only ever heard them whisper past my head in words I do not wish to remember or repeat. Would rather press palm to palm and whisper poems. Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Would rather smile, warm as stew-filled belly, and break bread. I will not ask the flames I cook with for identification when they burn more orange than red, white, or blue, as I do not know how to eat in English. No sé cómo comer en español. I do not know how to breathe in English. No sé cómo respirar en español. I do not know how to bleed in English. No sé cómo sangrar en español, but I think it is the same. Creo que es lo mismo con mis palabras y con mi lengua rota. Yo trato hablar with my words and with my broken tongue. I try to speak. I'm going to take a small sip of tea. Any questions, comments, or concerns? I can feel my throat's a little So that poem is unfortunately still only increasing in its relevance, which breaks my heart consistently. And so I have unfortunately read that poem at that same detention center many, many times since. As have other friends, in fact. And so I hope that it is able to comfort someone somewhere. But we still have a lot of work to do collectively. Again, I'm a deeply feeling person. And all of this outpouring of love is very much a part of who I am. And I don't find humanity to be, to politicize whether it's not someone's human, and making that a political debate is something that I find a tragic experience. And so borders in and of themselves, right? And the way that they cross people is something that we all should be more familiar with and hopefully have some passion around. So a lot of my work, again, is born from this eruption of deep feeling and deep frustration, and a sense of powerlessness. And yet at the same time, I do consider the ability to share words, right, as a type of power, right? So I think that art is an essential tool in advancing equity, right? And moving towards justice and liberation, right? Because, I think so Tony K. Bambara, right? Author of The Salt Eaters and many other pieces, right? But that's, I think, the piece that most people know Tony K. Bambara for, right? But so the artist's duty is to, oh, sorry, now I'm quoting Nina Simone, the artist's duty is to reflect the times. But the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible, is Tony K. Bambara. And so part of that, right, it's you can't separate those things. And so that we need to have the artists who are the dreamers, who are the visionaries, right? Who are able to share something more beautiful, more perfect for us to move toward, right? Because if we can't envision a beautiful future, it's very, very easy to get stuck and not believe in it, right? We have to envision it first before we can even work towards it, right? So there are a lot of artists, that's part of the role of artists, right? Is to imagine a better future, a more beautiful future, a more liberated future, right? So that's something that some artists do, right? It's also important to examine like what exists currently, like what are we in, right? Because there's so many things that we're not supposed to discuss that are considered taboo. And there's so many ways that we're gaslit, right? And so we have to really, it's up to the artist to like shine light in all of these shadowy spaces, right? And so art does that role as well. But it's also important, I think, to engage the heart, right? So I think about Sonia Sanchez, right? So she said that, any movement that is not rooted in love is not sustainable, right? We have to engage the heart. And that's another thing that artists can do and can help us with, right? Is to like get people to care and feel deeply, right? And so I do try to move between all of those spaces because I think all of them are urgent, all of them are necessary. And I don't think that any movement is sustainable without art. And so again, though, who can access that, right? We start thinking about power and what's the relationship between power and storytelling, right? And so when we consider, right, particularly I think about this like being a writer, there's still a great deal of inequity in the publishing industry, right? And so thinking about that relationship between power and who decides which stories we read and hear, when we think about what a syllabus looks like, right? And who's on it, who's not, right? Who's considered part of a canon, who's in the library, who do we consider part of our text, right? Who's part of our language, right? Who represents us? And also who makes those decisions about who you read, about which stories you hear, about which ones have value, about which ones have excellence, right? And also like thinking about how those stories that you read and hear change you. How are you represented in those stories? What's your relationship to that? How are you misrepresented in those stories, right? What's your relationship to that? How do all of these stories change the world around us? How do they impact our worldview, right? And again, what role does power play in all of those things? So one kind of power that we all have, though, is the ability to share our own stories, the ability to share our own narratives. And I would argue that not only do we have the power to share our own stories, right? But I think it's also, we have the obligation to. And so I think that it's also something that you're required to, right? If you don't define, right? So Audre Lorde said, if I don't define myself for myself, right? I would have been crunching other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. And that is true. It's so true for me as well. It's one of my favorite quotes from Audre Lorde. There are many. But I think about that frequently, daily. There are people who have fantasies for me. And if I let those be the story of me, I would not be here, right? So it's extremely important to me that I define myself for myself. And I'm going to let you know who I am rather than the other way around. Because no one else is ever going to get it right. And that's also true for you, right? I could make up your story all day and I'm an okay writer, but it's not going to be true. It's never going to be all the way thoroughly accurate the way that you can tell it, right? And so claiming that power and sharing your own story, sharing your own narrative and perspective, again, is an exceptionally political act, claiming your power. What? Look at all of us. Politically powerful. What? I love it. I love to see it. So thinking about those things, right? And how we share those stories. I'm going to jump back into a couple of more poems because I want to make sure that we get into them and I don't want to forget to read them. I can talk for days, guys, as it happens. But there are many, many different ways that we think about, like when I think about the stories we get told, right? The stories we inherit and sort of the legends we inherit, right? I wrote this piece when my daughter was 17. And I was singing this song that I learned this story and went, wait. And then I started examining some other stories. Yeah. And so sometimes we inherit these classic stories and we also inherit heroes. And oftentimes we don't get a chance to really examine those heroes and examine what a hero is and how that happens. And also the complication of like being able to love someone who is problematic, harmful. And of course, since then, there have been many movements, including Me Too, in which a lot of different people who we grew up with ideas about, those ideas have shifted, right? And so this poem interrogates a little bit of that. And this poem is called Mustangs. I've been really trying, baby, trying to hold back this feeling for so long. And if you feel like I feel, baby, come on. Oh, come on. Janice Hunter was a 17-year-old high school student when 34-year-old Marvin Gaye crooned her open. When you type Janice Hunter into Wikipedia, it forcibly redirects to Marvin Gaye's page. He is, after all, the only reason we know her name. When you Google Janice Hunter, the first result is the headline, Marvin Gaye's wife reveals how he tortured her. She still speaks of loving him. Does she still have a name? Lori Maddox was a 15-year-old virgin when 27-year-old David Bowie groomed her wide open for Jimmy Page to follow, then Mick Jagger, who sang to her of wild horses. And of course, young girls are Mustangs from the Spanish mustango, meaning ownerless beasts. Mustangs have no natural predators but the men who catch and break them. Childhood living is easy to do. To break a wild horse, first you must gain its trust. Sing to it, call it pretty until you mount. Get the reins on quickly, wild beasts must be controlled from the head. Give it a new name, something easy for you to say, like baby. She will forget she ever owned the wind. I was 13 when the first man boy tried to tell me he loved me. He was 20. I pretended not to hear him and hung up. I was 15 when the second man boy tried to tell me he loved me. He was 20. I pretended not to hear him and hung up. I was 16 when the third man boy tried to tell me he loved me. He was much older than 20. Pretended not to hear him and hung up. And oh, how they loved me. Called me muse, watching playful in open fields. Fame makes a man take things over. Called me quiet, teasing with handfuls of oats. Fame, what you want is in the limo. Called me beautiful until I stopped kicking. Called me theirs, called it love. Is it any wonder? Say, there's nothing wrong with me loving you. There's nothing wrong with me loving you. There's nothing wrong with me loving you. Say it like a mantra until it feels true, until the saddle feels like skin, until the yoke feels like religion. There's nothing wrong with me loving you. Does love mean to lasso a feral mare? Does love ride bareback and call itself quick? Does love mean to lasso the thunder in my hips until it all feels yours? Does love always catch as a bit in the mouth, wrap around the throat like so? The first time I told a man I loved him, I coughed up a rusted chain and a collar, traced it with my tongue, and found my own name already engraved there, just below my mother's. And wild, wild horses, we'll ride them someday. And so that is for myself, my daughter, and also all of the people who might be able to relate to that in some different ways. And again, navigating that space, right, around heroes, right? These are all songs I grew up loving. These are all artists I grew up loving. These are all still songs I love, right? That's why they're in the poem, because I know those songs, right? And so do most of you. And there's a reason for that, right? And also this style and this process of power when it comes to gender dynamics, power dynamics, age dynamics, fame dynamics, wealth dynamics, right? All of those things play out, and it is still very, very common for 17-year-old girls to be groomed by 34-year-old men, unfortunately. So I wrote this when my daughter was 17 and was like, you know what? Here's what we're not doing. so, so that's what that piece, it's sort of the root of that one. Any questions, comments, concerns before we dive in? I'd like to read maybe one more poem, and then I'd like to bring us into a space where I'll bring you into a writing prompt where you can write some poetry. And those of you who are watching this later, you can enjoy the prompts with us, but you won't have a chance to share with us unless, of course, you find my website. You can email it to me. I always love finding what happens with a workshop. So if you want to send a piece later, that's completely fine with me. Definitely open to receiving that. So I'm going to share perhaps one more piece. And this one is called Sweetback. I think about, the summer of 2020 was a wild year, obviously. We all know that. With COVID hitting, it was definitely a wild time. And then, of course, during the summer, George Floyd was murdered and there was an uprising, right, all over the country. And I was asked to speak many, many places, all over, all the time. And perhaps one of the tragedies of 2020 was that I didn't have to write anything new for about Black Lives Mattering, right? Because this is not new. It's not a new movement. It was not a new moment. It was a recurrence of an ongoing series. So this piece is dedicated to that, and this is called Sweetback. When Chris Dorner trained his gun on the LAPD, when he released a manifesto addressed to America, subject last resort, we knew it was clearly a suicide note. I take no joy in the blood on his hands, nor his burnt body, but it come as no great shock that some policemen look like overseers even now. So yes, when he quoted D.H. Lawrence, I never saw a wild thing feel sorry for itself. I wanted to tell him to run. Not because he was innocent, but even the foreshadow of defeat is enough to awaken the adrenaline when your bones remember the burning. I wanted to tell him to run, not for himself, nor his own iron hands, but for Fred Hampton and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and Amadou Diallo and Troy Davis and Trayvon Martin and Paul Childs and Ramarley Graham and Sean Bell and Oscar Grant and Rakia Boyd and Timothy Stansbury and Orlando Barlow and Aaron Campbell and Victor Steen and Stephen Washington and Alonzo Ashley and Wendell Allen and Ayanna Jones and Ronald Madison and Marvin Booker and James Brissett and John Crawford III and Eric Garner and Barbara Dawson and Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and Walter Scott and Cameron Tillman and Eric Harris and Sandra Bland and Alton Sterling and Philando Castile and Alva Brazil and so many more names that I will never know. And I did not know any of these people, but damned if they couldn't have all been my family. And I know they say it's not a war, but damned if I don't feel like an insurgent sometimes. And no, I have never killed anyone, but have long since admitted that I could. I mean, America, you got big guns. I ain't scared though, not with this working womb. America, you thought the Black Panther free breakfast program was scary? You ain't met me yet. I mean, we've been through a lot, America. I think that now for every one of our children you allow to be murdered, I will make two with brothers gully as they come, all grit and swagger and knuckle and earth and gleam, beards all unapologizing. Brothers who won't smile at you, brothers who won't ever be afraid of you, brothers who smell just like the sun. We will raise our babies together like militia ticking. We will detonate them on your college campuses, at your job, in your neighborhood. We will suck up all the financial aid. We will teach Fred Hampton in the classrooms until his blood can stop screaming. You don't want it with we, America. We, Black mothers, are angry as ever, are fertile as ever, and unafraid of our children. I'm not leaving, America. We will take over the schools and send your daughters home smiling like Patty Hearst, America. You feeling me now? You fearing me now? Might even have your babies, America. They will be Black too. America, this is a war. America, I will send my sons to all your corners. You will be needing their light. America, this is no manifesto. This is a love poem. Making love is the only way I know how to save you. Your hatred and fear are a cancer. Your teeth are rotting from your head. America, now is the time to call on whatever God you pray to. Give thanks for my beautiful sons. Yes, there will be sons, Black sons, and we will call them all Jamal and Rakim, and we will love them. We will love them. We're not dying, America. We will live forever. And that is Sweetback. And with that, we come to the part where you will write. And so I'm going to share some writing prompts with you. And I thought that I would probably bring them up on the screen, right? I think in many ways, I think particularly for people who were born and identified as female growing up, don't necessarily have a lot of cultural permission around rage or anger. And children in general don't necessarily get given a lot of permission towards expression of anger, right? We don't have a lot of like cultural language for that, for allowing that space to exist. And yet children have a really, really strong sense of justice and injustice. Children are born knowing what's fair and unfair, oftentimes, right? When you look at children, you pour one little more juice than another. The children know it. They recognize it. They're keenly aware of it. And they will let you know, right, that something is unfair. And they often don't always have power, right, to negotiate that, to navigate that. And so there is, I think, an unhealthy balance of rage because we don't have the language or the tools to process it in a way that is reasonable. So my 5-minute journaling prompt for you is thus. My questions are, what was your relationship to anger during your childhood? What is your earliest memory of being enraged at an injustice and unfairness? And what lessons were you given on how to process? So I thought we would take about 5 minutes to write on this. And then I would love to open this up for a moment if anyone would like to share some of their thoughts on these prompts. Any questions, comments, concerns before we dive in? Okay, I'm going to leave these up on the screen and we're going to take 5 minutes and then we will return. And for those of you at home, you can find me at suziqsmith.com and there's a contact page and you can certainly send me this piece later if you are inspired to write by these prompts watching this later. And those have been 5 minutes. So I'll just check into the chat to see if anyone would like to share some of their responses to the prompts. That is totally fine. You don't have to share, or you can certainly send it to me later via my website. I'm happy to do that. I'll share one more set of prompts with you before we go today. And so that you have some other things to sort of reflect on. But before we get into it, I'll share my screen again. I'll share this piece here. And so this is related, but there is a different set of prompts. And so I want to bring these up and share them with you and sort of talk through that a little bit. Here we are. So again, in that conversation around anger and your experiences with it, right? This is a lot of times where that sense of injustice gives rise to our first real passionate feelings of anger in our youth, right? So another way to sort of make art with this, put these feelings somewhere, like kind of create something with it. I would encourage you to spend another 5 minutes or more, and if you feel free to revisit these later as well. Instructions on how to be angry, right? So if you could teach a previous version of yourself how to be angry, what would you want to say? If you met someone who couldn't access their rage, how would you teach them to do it? And what are the essential ingredients for rage, right? It can be helpful with these sometimes considering a time that you wanted to express some anger and couldn't. Because again, the relationship between who can express rage and power are pretty distinct, right? It's a pretty clear line, right? So thinking about a time in which you didn't have the power to express what you wanted to, what you needed to, right? Going back and writing to yourself around like how you would instruct your former self to do that now, how you would navigate that situation, and what did you really, really want to say when you couldn't. So I'm going to leave this up just for a moment so you can copy these or reflect on them. And so we have it for the recording. And on that note, I'm going to stop the share. So before we close out for today, I'll check one last time to see if any of you have questions or comments or concerns. Before we wrap this up. Okay. Well, thank you all so very much for being part of this journey. Thank you, Jennifer. I see you in the chat. And thank you for being here. Oh, I see your question now. So for me to write a poem, I always say how long it takes to write a poem is a lifetime, right? From my whole life up to the point that I write that one, it took that many years. So anything I write right now will have taken me about 42 and a half years to write. Is how long it takes. And so it may happen, in a matter of moments, and it might take, but again, that moment, right, is I might write that poem in 15 minutes, but it's also that 15 minutes is the culmination of all of the years it took me to get to that 15-minute point, right? So it really does take a lifetime. But I just do stay in a regular writing practice, right? So that also helps. So that when there is a thought, an observation, a feeling that I need to process, right? I'm pretty immediately, that the ability to write about it is usually available to me because I stay in practice and stay in pretty close relationship with my writing. And so that helps quite a lot, and that makes it a little bit easier to access. But there are some poems that really, like, there will be a draft and then another draft and another draft, and it might take me several years of trying to write that exact same poem before I finally am in a place where I feel good about it. So it takes some efforts, some years and years, right? And then sometimes I'll write a piece and throw the pen down after like a single, writing session, and there's never an edit. This is exactly how it goes, and that's how the poem stays. So, but I will say it does take a lifetime. And if I can't seem to access the words for it, it's the expression is going to come through one way or another, right? So maybe it's a matter of humming. Maybe I will cook about it. Maybe I'll walk about it. Maybe I'll dream about it. There are a lot of different ways that I'll process until I'm able to express what I need to express, right? I'll even sometimes make visual art. My visual art is not very good, but that's not always the point, right? The point is actually not really ever making high quality art. Like, what even is quality? And how do we determine what's good? Like, of course, that by itself is both personal and political, right? So determining whether or not we like it or whether or not it's useful, all of those things, we can have those relationships to it. But I don't generally feel like my visual art is something I want to share with the world. Sometimes I can make a mean collage, but that's about it. But anyway, there are a lot of different ways. I think that there's, again, I have to find a way to express things or I explode. So that means that I need to like find a way. So if it's not coming out in words, then maybe I will paint about it. Maybe I will cook about it. Maybe I will do something else with it. But as someone who needs to create, that's what I'm going to do always in some capacity. And it might not always be poetry, right? I don't limit my expression to one art form. And I think it's important to consider all of the different ways that you have to express, whether it's talking to a best friend, whether it's dancing. I dance about a lot of things, dance a lot of things out. So there's a lot of different ways to process that, right? Sometimes it is just a very, very sweaty dance session. Sometimes it's a kickboxing session. There's a lot of different ways to express, right? So, but those are some ways that I approach it. Does that answer your questions? I hope so. Okay, good, good. Well, thank you very, very much for being here today. Thank you again, James, for hosting, and thank you for creating this beautiful event. I hope that some of this has been helpful and valuable for you. And again, if you'd like to share some of your writing later, feel free to message me on my website, or you can find me on any of the social medias. I'm probably there. I think I might even still have a Tumblr. There might even still be a Friendster with my name on it. Not really sure. but I'm pretty easy to find if you Google Suzi Q Smith. So thank you again for being here and thank you for having me. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are. Thanks again for hanging out, listening to poetry and writing with me today.